Hello, prepare to be amazed as we dust off the pages of history and bring its stories to life. The Black Death, an unprecedented pandemic that struck Europe in the 14th century, remains one of the most haunting and pivotal events in human history. It profoundly altered the course of European civilization, leaving a trail of death, despair, and societal upheaval in its wake. This comprehensive account delves into the origins, progression, and lasting consequences of the Black Death, shedding light on the tragic events that unfolded between 1347 and 1351. Prelude to Plague. As we navigate through the annals of history and take a glimpse into Europe during the early 14th century, it becomes palpable that the continent was teetering on the edge of a profound transformation. Europe, in this era, was a tinderbox of crises, environmental, political, and religious, each exuding a level of tension that, when combined, undermined societal resilience and established an unfortunate foundation for the catastrophe that was to come, the Black Death. The first 2 decades of the 14th century were marked by a series of severe climatic fluctuations, sometimes referred to as the Little Ice Age. The weather patterns became erratic, with the previously warm and stable medieval climate optimum giving way to a colder, more unpredictable period. This climatic shift was especially devastating for an agrarian society heavily reliant on predictable seasonal patterns. Between 1315 and 1317, Europe experienced the Great Famine, a relentless grip of hunger and destitution that resulted from this drastic climate change. Unceasing rains led to crop failures across the continent, reducing the yield of critical foodstuffs such as wheat, oats, and barley. It was a time of dread and despair, where chronic food shortages led to malnutrition, weakened immune systems, lower fertility, and higher infant mortality. The European population, once booming in the high Middle Ages, began to stagnate and decline. Parallel to these environmental woes was a labyrinth of political instability. The beginning of the 14th century saw a series of conflicts, including the bitter dynastic disputes of the 100 Years' War between England and France. Power struggles within regions also contributed to a pervasive sense of insecurity. Nobility and monarchs clashed over taxes and territorial rights, which led to skirmishes and rebellions, further draining resources and destabilizing kingdoms. Religious turmoil was equally tumultuous during this period. The Catholic Church was a formidable force in medieval Europe, wielding extensive influence over both spiritual and temporal matters. However, early signs of corruption, power misuse, and theological disputes were fermenting discontent among the populace. This growing tension would eventually result in significant religious transformations, including the Avignon Papacy and later the Reformation. Societal structures were changing too. The feudal system that had defined medieval Europe was beginning to fray. The manorial system, which rested on the agricultural labor of serfs, was strained by the shift in climate and the ensuing famine. Labor shortages began to erode the old bonds of feudal obligation, setting the stage for dramatic economic and social changes in the centuries to come. As we set the stage with this understanding of pre-plague Europe, we see a continent fraught with multiple crises that significantly weakened societal resilience. The consequence of these simultaneous tensions and crises was a society predisposed to the effects of a sweeping pandemic. Little did Europe know in the early 14th century, but it stood on the precipice of one of the deadliest episodes in human history, the Black Death. The comprehensive understanding of these antecedent conditions is essential to appreciating the full magnitude and profound impacts of the cataclysm that was to follow. Origins and spread of the plague. The study of the Black Death's origin and its precipitous spread across Europe uncovers a grim narrative of transmission and devastation. The plague, believed to have emerged from the arid plains of Central or East Asia, struck with a deadly force that permanently scarred the human landscape. Historians and scientists posit that the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the cause of the Black Death, initially infected rodent populations in the Central Asian steppes. The highly efficient vectors of this virulent disease were fleas, particularly Xenopsilla chiopus, known as the oriental rat flea. This flea would ingest the bacteria by feeding on an infected rodent, often a black rat. The bacteria would multiply within the flea, blocking its gut. When the flea fed again, it would regurgitate the bacteria into the new host's bloodstream, transmitting the plague. Central and East Asia, particularly the region around China, Mongolia, and the Central Asian steppes, was a vibrant tapestry of trade routes and military pathways during the Middle Ages. One of these trade routes was the famed Silk Road, which linked the East and the West, carrying not only goods but also ideas, cultures, and, unfortunately, diseases. Caravans of traders and the movements of Mongol armies inadvertently carried the infected rodents westward. By the mid-14th century, the plague had reached Crimea, a critical hub in the Genoese trade network. Merchant ships laden with goods, sailors, and black rats infested with plague-carrying fleas sailed from the Crimean ports. The disease thus found a pathway to Europe, riding on the waves of trade that connected the continent with the wider world. The first recorded instance of the plague in Europe was in the Sicilian port of Messina in October 1347. Here, a dozen Genoese trading ships arrived carrying a most unwelcome cargo, the Black Death. The local authorities, alarmed by the dying sailors and the virulence of the disease, expelled the ships, but it was too late. The plague had gained a foothold in Europe. From Sicily, the contagion expanded at an alarming rate. Italy, with its thriving cities and extensive trade networks, was particularly susceptible. By the end of 1347, the Black Death had reached southern Italy, sweeping through Naples, Rome, and Florence. The plague moved relentlessly, charting a course of death and despair, north into France and west to Spain. By the summer of 1348, the disease had crossed the English Channel, devastating towns and villages across England. Scandinavia did not escape the Black Death's grip, with the plague arriving by the end of 1348. By 1351, it had swept across the breadth and depth of Europe, reaching as far as Russia. The rapidity of the Black Death's spread was a result of a confluence of factors. The bacterium's high virulence, the efficiency of the rat-flea-human transmission cycle, and the dense population networks of medieval Europe all facilitated the swift advance of the plague. The ubiquity of trade routes, by land and sea, ensured that few areas remained untouched. Within a span of a few years, the Black Death had transformed from an unknown Asian disease into a pan-European catastrophe, the repercussions of which would echo through the centuries. Symptoms and effects. The Black Death, in its indiscriminate carnage, laid bare the human fragility against the force of nature. The manifestation of the disease was as terrifying as its swift and sweeping spread, painting a grim picture of the medieval world under siege. The initial signs of infection were insidiously mundane, often beginning with a chill, fever, fatigue, headaches, and aching limbs, symptoms commonly associated with many less deadly diseases. However, as the disease progressed, it distinguished itself with a horrifying specificity. A distinctive marker of the plague was the appearance of swollen, painful lymph nodes, known as buboes, hence the term bubonic plague. These were primarily found in the armpit, groin, and neck areas, varying in size from a small egg to an apple. The buboes were excruciating, often accompanied by a high fever that could reach up to 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. In some cases, the skin over and around the buboes would necrotize, turning dark purple or black, a phenomenon that possibly led to the name Black Death. Other symptoms included delirium, neurological complications, and in the later stages, disseminated intravascular coagulation, which led to the formation of necrotic patches on the skin, further contributing to the condition's high mortality. More horrifyingly, the entire course of the disease, from the first signs of fever to an agonizing death, could be as short as 2 to 7 days. The mortality rates of the Black Death were astronomical. Contemporary accounts often speak of deserted villages and cities filled with the dead. Modern estimates suggest that between 30% to 60% of Europe's entire population perished in the plague, although these figures varied regionally. In absolute numbers, this equates to an estimated death toll of 75 million to 200 million people, a scale of devastation that is almost incomprehensible. Some areas were hit harder than others. In Florence, one of the epicenters of the plague, the death toll was so high that the city's famous chronicler, Giovanni Boccaccio, wrote that the living could not be found sufficient to bury the dead. England's population was nearly halved, while in regions of France, an estimated 2/3 of the population perished. The rural peasantry, the backbone of the agrarian economy, was severely affected, leading to an acute labor shortage that had wide-ranging economic implications. Beyond the immediate mortality, the plague also left a significant number of survivors deeply traumatized and fearful of a recurrence. The sheer scale of the death and suffering led to profound psychological impacts, influencing religious beliefs, societal structures, and cultural expressions, all of which were transformed in the aftermath of the Black Death. The plague, with its high contagion and mortality, redefined the parameters of life and death in the medieval world, leaving in its wake a landscape of fear and loss that would shape the trajectory of European history. Society in chaos. In the wake of the Black Death's relentless sweep across Europe, society found itself entangled in an unprecedented web of chaos and disorder. The plague, a monstrous invisible enemy, shattered the established socio-economic norms, disrupted communal bonds, and unleashed a tide of fear and superstition that took root in the medieval psyche. Rural communities, the heart of Europe's predominantly agrarian economy, bore the brunt of the devastation. As the plague ravaged these communities, it decimated the agricultural workforce. Fields were abandoned, crops left unharvested, and livestock left untended. The result was an agricultural crisis that deepened the economic and social turmoil. The acute labor shortage caused a seismic shift in the feudal system. Serfs and peasants, realizing their newfound bargaining power, began to demand higher wages or sought employment in towns and cities, leading to a surge in social mobility and the decline of the manorial system. Towns and cities were no safer havens. The densely populated urban areas provided an ideal breeding ground for the disease. The plague spread swiftly and mercilessly through the crowded, unsanitary conditions of medieval cities. Death became an omnipresent specter, with bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. Contemporary accounts paint a grim picture of deserted streets, closed shops, and overflowing cemeteries. The social fabric of towns was strained to breaking point as fear of infection overrode communal bonds. People avoided their sick neighbors, and even families were torn apart as members fled from their infected relatives. The speed and mysterious nature of the disease, along with its grotesque symptoms, fostered a climate of fear and uncertainty. This fear, coupled with a lack of scientific understanding, bred superstition and fostered a need to attribute the disease to a tangible cause. Minority groups, already marginalized in society, bore the brunt of this need for scapegoats. Jews, in particular, were targeted in a wave of violent pogroms. Fueled by anti-Semitic sentiments, rumors spread that Jews were poisoning wells to cause the plague. In the Swiss city of Strasbourg, in February 1349, around 2,000 Jews were massacred and their homes were burned down. Similar atrocities were carried out across other European cities from Spain to Germany. Other marginalized groups, such as beggars, lepers, and foreigners, also faced persecution. The fear of the disease was so potent that it erased the medieval codes of charity and Christian piety, replacing them with an almost paranoid need for self-preservation. The Black Death upended the medieval world, transforming it from a society defined by feudal obligations and manorial economies into one marked by chaos, fear, and social mobility. The plague laid bare the prejudices and fears of society, sparking a frenzy of blame and violence. Yet it also set the stage for significant societal and cultural shifts that would redefine the trajectory of European history. The specter of the Black Death, therefore, served not only as a grim reminder of the mortality and fragility of human life, but also as a catalyst for transformative change. Religious responses. In the shadow of the Black Death's inexorable sweep, the spiritual and religious landscape of Europe underwent a profound transformation. The Church, hitherto the bulwark of faith, guidance, and solace, found itself confronting a crisis that defied its understanding and subverted its authority. In the medieval worldview, there was an intimate bond between the spiritual and the material, the divine and the earthly. Catastrophes were seldom seen as purely natural phenomena, but rather as divine manifestations of celestial displeasure. Thus, the Black Death was interpreted by many as a potent sign of God's wrath, a divine chastisement for humanity's sins. This belief found a dramatic expression in the phenomenon of the flagellant orders, the flagellants, men, and occasionally women, who sought to atone for the collective sins of humanity, roamed from town to town, performing public acts of penance. These acts involved singing hymns, praying, and striking themselves with various instruments like whips or rods, often until they bled. Their rituals, marked by intense physical self-punishment, were aimed at appeasing the divine wrath and securing pardon for mankind's sins. The movement, although eventually condemned and suppressed by the Church, illustrated the desperation and religious fervor ignited by the plague. Yet, amid this widespread fear and chaos, the Church's inability to provide a satisfactory response to the Black Death led to growing disillusionment among the populace. The clergy, despite their spiritual role, were as susceptible to the plague as the laity. Many priests, monks, and nuns perished, having contracted the disease while administering last rites or caring for the sick. Their death not only caused a shortage of religious officials, but also deeply undermined the Church's spiritual authority. How, many asked, could the very intermediaries of God succumb to this divine punishment? Criticism of the Church grew as it struggled to respond effectively to the crisis. The rapid death toll required modifications in burial practices and the administration of last rites, creating the perception of a Church more focused on procedure than on spiritual solace. Furthermore, the Church's inability to halt the disease's progress or offer a convincing explanation, coupled with the evident wealth and perceived corruption within its ranks, became sources of widespread discontent. This dissatisfaction set the stage for the religious schisms of the later Middle Ages and the early modern period, culminating in the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Religious responses to the Black Death, therefore, were multifaceted. The plague precipitated a heightened sense of religious anxiety, leading to extreme expressions of piety, such as the flagellants. At the same time, it exposed the limitations and failings of the Church, igniting a wave of criticism that would eventually shatter the religious uniformity of Europe. As such, the Black Death not only redefined Europe's demographic and social structure, but also profoundly transformed its spiritual and religious landscape. Economic consequences. The Black Death, while often regarded primarily as a demographic disaster, also instigated seismic shifts in the economic landscape of Europe. The plague's massive death toll profoundly altered labor dynamics, disrupted long-established trade networks, and ushered in a period of economic instability and transformation that would echo through the centuries. One of the most immediate economic consequences of the plague was the drastic reduction in the labor force. As the disease disproportionately affected the peasantry, Europe's agrarian economy faced an acute labor crisis. Entire villages were wiped out, fields were left untilled, and harvests uncollected. The sharp decline in labor availability resulted in a sudden and dramatic increase in wages for the survivors. Laborers could demand higher wages and better conditions, and many seized the opportunity to move away from the hardest-hit rural areas to towns and cities in search of improved prospects. This sudden increase in wages and the concurrent decline in population led to a marked improvement in living standards for many survivors. With fewer people to feed and more money to spend, consumption of meat, dairy, and other higher quality foods rose. At the same time, the fall in population also led to an oversupply of goods and a decrease in the price of many commodities, further benefiting the surviving population. However, these improvements were not uniform, and the overall economic recovery was slow and fraught with challenges. Many agricultural estates were abandoned, and the resumption of normal farming activities was hampered by the lack of labor. While wages for laborers rose, land rents plummeted, causing hardship for the landowning classes. Additionally, the disruption of trade routes due to the plague led to a slump in long-distance trade. Merchant activities were severely affected, and with the reduction in population, the demand for various goods also fell. In response to these economic shifts, authorities attempted to enforce wage controls and reinstate pre-plague feudal obligations through laws such as England's 1351 Statute of Labourers. However, these measures were largely unsuccessful and met with significant resistance, further deepening social tensions and contributing to events such as the 1381 Peasants' Revolt in England. The economic upheaval in the wake of the Black Death also led to shifts in wealth and the emergence of a new social class. With many nobles dying without heirs, their lands often reverted to the crown or were bought up by the emerging bourgeoisie, leading to a consolidation of wealth and the rise of a new social order. Long-term effects and legacy. The Black Death was far more than a historical footnote or a singular event of devastating morbidity and mortality. Instead, it marked a turning point in European history, radically altering the trajectory of societal, cultural, and scientific development. The plague's long-term effects rippled through every aspect of society, igniting transformations that would shape the world as we know it today. One of the most profound and lasting impacts of the Black Death was its effect on the social and economic structure of Europe. The severe labor shortage following the plague's devastation served to accelerate the decline of the feudal system. The increased bargaining power of laborers, coupled with the failures of laws like the Statute of Laborers to suppress wages, undermined the manorial economy. The growing urban proletariat, a nascent middle class, and a shift from labor-intensive grain farming to less labor-intensive livestock farming further eroded the traditional feudal hierarchy. Thus, the Black Death, while initially a catalyst for economic crisis and social upheaval, eventually contributed to the economic and social transformations that marked the transition from the Middle Ages to the early modern period. Culturally, the Black Death left an indelible mark on European art and literature. The grim realities of plague and death imbued much of the work from this period with a somber tone, reflected in the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, motif found in visual arts, music, and literature. Yet paradoxically, the same cataclysm that exposed society to such stark portrayals of mortality also kindled the spark of Renaissance humanism. With the Church's authority weakened by its inability to combat the plague, a new intellectual movement emphasizing human capability and empirical knowledge began to flourish, paving the way for the Renaissance. The Black Death also had significant implications for the development of medicine and public health. The plague's unprecedented scale and devastation underscored the inadequacies of contemporary medical knowledge and practices, based largely on the humoral theory of Hippocrates and Galen. This spurred on a reassessment and critique of existing medical thought, paving the way for the gradual shift towards more empirical and observation-based approaches in the centuries to follow. Moreover, the Black Death instigated some of the first organized public health measures, including quarantines and the creation of plague hospitals, or lazarettos. In an epidemiological sense, the plague reshaped the demographic contours of Europe. The population loss led to a genetic shift, as evidenced by recent studies indicating that Europeans today are descended from a group that was a minority before the plague. Thus, the Black Death may have not only shaped the cultural, social, and economic fabric of Europe, but also left its mark on the very DNA of its descendants. Re-evaluations and modern perspectives. Over the centuries since the Black Death first wrought its devastation, our understanding of this monumental event has been continually evolving, shaped and reshaped by new discoveries, interpretations, and methodologies. In recent years, this evolution has been particularly pronounced as advances in scientific techniques, particularly in genetics and archaeology, have provided fresh insights into the plague and its impacts. Meanwhile, the rise of global health challenges in the 21st century has also sparked renewed interest in the Black Death, prompting us to reflect on its significance in a modern context. One of the most groundbreaking developments in our understanding of the Black Death has come from the field of genetics. The advent of ancient DNA, aDNA, analysis has allowed researchers to identify Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, in the remains of 14th century plague victims. This has definitively confirmed the bacterial cause of the disease, resolving long-standing debates and challenging earlier theories that proposed other diseases as the culprit. Moreover, genomic comparisons between the 14th century strain and modern strains of Y. pestis have revealed significant evolutionary changes, offering new insights into the bacterium's historical pathogenicity and its current epidemiology. Archaeological research has also significantly enriched our understanding of the Black Death. Excavations of mass plague burials, combined with bioarchaeological techniques, have provided valuable data on the age, sex, and social status of victims, as well as on their diet and health prior to the plague. These findings have offered more nuanced perspectives on the plague's demographic impact and its social and economic consequences. Meanwhile, historical research continues to reassess and reinterpret the Black Death's cultural and societal impacts. Scholars have explored how the plague influenced art, literature, and religious thought, examining its role in shaping the ideological shift from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. In the field of economic history, debates continue over the extent to which the Black Death contributed to the decline of feudalism and the transition to a capitalist economy. In the modern context, the Black Death's significance has gained a new dimension amid contemporary global health challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic has provoked comparisons with the Black Death, highlighting both similarities and contrasts. Like the Black Death, COVID-19 has had far-reaching impacts beyond its death toll, disrupting economies and societies on a global scale. Yet the responses to the two pandemics also underscore the advances made since the 14th century, particularly in the fields of medicine and public health. In this light, the Black Death serves as a potent reminder of the potential scale of pandemic diseases, while also highlighting the importance of scientific understanding and effective public health measures. It provides a historical context for understanding the societal and cultural impacts of pandemics, offering lessons on resilience, adaptation, and transformation in the face of such crises. In conclusion, our understanding of the Black Death continues to evolve and deepen, informed by interdisciplinary research and resonating with our contemporary experiences. As we navigate the challenges of the 21st century, the Black Death remains a pivotal event in human history, offering valuable insights into the biological, societal, and cultural dimensions of global health crises. More information and facts, medicine and public health in the 14th century. To fully appreciate the cataclysm that was the Black Death, we must first immerse ourselves in the medical milieu of the 14th century. This period was marked by a coalescence of scientific thought, inherited from ancient Greek physicians, religious influences, and nascent attempts at empiricism. It is within this framework that society grappled with the horrific specter of the plague and sought remedies and preventatives to combat it. In 14th century Europe, the prevailing medical theory was the humorism, derived from the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen. According to this theory, human health was dictated by the balance of four bodily humors: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Disease was believed to result from an imbalance of these humors, and treatment was aimed at restoring balance, often through practices such as bloodletting or the administration of specific diets. When confronted with the Black Death, many physicians interpreted it through the lens of this humoral theory. Miasma, or bad air, was widely believed to be the primary cause of plague. The notion of contagion, while present, was less emphasized and was often conflated with miasma theory. The plague was thought to be spread through the air corrupted by decaying organic matter or harmful celestial influences, resulting in a harmful imbalance of the humors in the body. As for treatment, the strategies were as varied as they were desperate. Bloodletting and purgation were commonly practiced, aimed at ridding the body of excess or corrupted humors. Dietary regulation was also prescribed, with physicians recommending consumption or avoidance of certain foods based on their perceived qualities and impacts on the humors. Herbal remedies were widespread too, including concoctions such as theriac, a compound of multiple ingredients believed to be a universal antidote. Alongside these treatments, various amulets and talismans were employed for protection, often bearing religious symbols or inscriptions. The line between medicine and religion was porous, reflecting the deep intertwinement of faith and healing in medieval society. Prayers, processions, and acts of penitence were considered just as crucial in combating the plague as were physical treatments. In terms of public health, the Black Death spurred some of the earliest organized responses to a health crisis. Quarantine measures were instituted, notably in Italian city-states like Venice and Milan, where ships arriving from plague-stricken areas were isolated and specific areas were designated for the sick. The establishment of pest houses or lazarettos also marked an attempt to isolate the diseased from the healthy population. However, these measures were often hampered by the limited understanding of disease transmission. Cleaning efforts, for instance, were aimed at purifying the air rather than eradicating fleas or rats, the actual vectors of the disease. The lack of an effective central health authority also meant that measures were applied inconsistently, with enforcement largely dependent on local initiative and resources. Reflecting on this from a contemporary perspective, it is easy to underscore the misconceptions and errors in the medieval approach to the plague. But doing so overlooks the ways in which these responses were grounded in the knowledge and beliefs of the time. More importantly, these efforts laid the groundwork for future developments in public health and medicine, offering the first glimpses of the systematic, society-wide responses to health crises that we are familiar with today. Individual experiences, voices from the shadows of the plague. To fully comprehend the magnitude and impact of the Black Death, it is essential to turn our gaze from the grand narrative of society, politics, and religion to the individual stories that echo from this era. These personal narratives offer an intimate window into the lived experiences of the plague, illuminating the human cost of this cataclysmic event. They reveal the terror, despair, and confusion experienced by individuals, along with moments of resilience, compassion, and hope. Surviving records provide a range of individual perspectives, though they are inevitably skewed towards the literate classes of the time. Still, they serve as poignant testimony to the breadth and depth of the plague's impact on personal lives. Among these, the chronicles of monks, priests, and scholars often provide the most detailed accounts of the plague. The Florentine chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, in his introduction to the Decameron, offers a gripping first-hand account of the plague's devastation in Florence. He describes the social disintegration that accompanied the disease. Brother abandoned brother, and very often wife abandoned husband, and even more frequently husband abandoned wife. His descriptions of the symptoms and the high mortality rates reflect both the physical horror and the social chaos of the plague. In Avignon, the physician Guy de Chauliac provided a detailed narrative of the plague's progression, including its symptoms and his attempts to treat them. As papal physician to Pope Clement VI, de Chauliac's observations were methodical and deeply informed. He also made the personal choice to remain in the city during the plague, offering care and comfort to the sick, despite the risk to his own life. In England, the clergyman Henry of Knighton chronicled the effects of the plague on his local community, depicting the suddenness of death and the mass burials. as well as the fear that gripped the populace. Knighton's account offers a perspective from a smaller community, highlighting the ubiquity of the plague's impact across the continent. While these accounts provide a glimpse into the experiences of the literate elite, they also offer indirect insights into the experiences of ordinary people who suffered the most due to their lack of resources and their proximity to infection in crowded urban centers or rural households. From descriptions of mass graves to depictions of desolate city streets and deserted villages, the experiences of the common folk are starkly etched into these narratives. Collectively, these individual accounts provide an intimate portrait of life during the Black Death. They capture the fear, despair, and uncertainty of the time, but also moments of courage, resilience, and compassion. They bear witness to the depths of suffering, but also to the power of the human spirit to endure and adapt in the face of unprecedented adversity. These personal narratives serve as a stark reminder that behind every grand event of history, there are countless individual lives, each marked by the tumult of their time. In the words of these survivors, we find echoes of our own experiences and responses to crisis, highlighting the timeless and universal dimensions of the human condition. Through their voices, the Black Death ceases to be an abstract historical event, instead becoming a deeply human experience. Global impact beyond the European continent. While the Black Death is often primarily associated with its devastation in Europe, its impact was far more widespread. As a pandemic, it reached across continents, leaving few regions untouched. In fact, its origins lie far from Europe, tracing back to the steppe regions of Central Asia. To fully understand the magnitude of this cataclysm, it is crucial to examine its global impact, particularly in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Asia. In Central and East Asia, the Black Death's origins, it wreaked considerable havoc. Evidence suggests that outbreaks occurred in China in the early 1330s, contributing to the fall of the Yuan dynasty. Descriptions in Chinese annals of symptoms similar to bubonic plague, coupled with records of widespread mortality, suggest the Black Death's presence. In the region of Hubei, for instance, the population reportedly fell by almost 90% between 1331 and 1351. The Middle East. The Middle East was similarly afflicted. The plague reached the region around 1347 to 48, carried by trading ships. The thriving trade networks that connected the Middle East to both Asia and Europe served as conduits for the disease. The contemporary Muslim scholar and historian Ibn Khaldun, himself a survivor of the plague, noted its devastating impact in his works. Major cities such as Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad experienced severe mortality rates. It is estimated that Cairo lost almost half its population, a catastrophic blow to one of the medieval world's most populous and vibrant cities. The political, social, and economic consequences were profound and contributed to the region's gradual decline. Africa. As for Africa, the evidence is less comprehensive, yet it is clear that North Africa, in particular, was significantly impacted, largely due to its close ties with the Mediterranean world. The city of Al-Majuba in Tunisia, for instance, lost an estimated 3/4 of its population. More research is needed, however, to fully understand the Black Death's impact on sub-Saharan Africa. The spread of the disease in these regions may have been influenced by trade routes, ecological factors, or patterns of human migration. This global perspective emphasizes that the Black Death was truly a pandemic, affecting societies far beyond Europe. The interconnectivity of the medieval world, mainly through trade and conquest, facilitated the disease's spread, demonstrating that even in the 14th century, global phenomena had the capacity to alter the course of societies across continents. Historiography of the Black Death. Shifting perspectives through time. The understanding of the Black Death, like any historical event, has been shaped and reshaped by generations of historians, each influenced by their own contexts, methodologies, and discoveries. To grasp how our comprehension of the plague has evolved, we must delve into the historiography of the Black Death, examining how interpretations have shifted over time and what these shifts reveal about the nature of historical inquiry itself. Early historians, writing in the decades and centuries following the plague, often focused on the moral and religious implications of the event. Boccaccio, for instance, viewed the plague as a divine punishment for human wickedness. Later, in the Enlightenment, historians began to emphasize more rational causes, such as miasma theory, that is, bad air or climatic changes. These interpretations reflected the intellectual climate of their time, illustrating how historical interpretation is influenced by contemporary attitudes and beliefs. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of positivist approaches to history, focusing on empirical evidence and attempting to create a scientific history. For historians of this period, the Black Death was often seen in terms of its demographic impact, with a focus on quantifying its death toll and charting its geographical spread. The discovery of the bacterium Yersinia pestis and its identification as the cause of the plague in the late 19th and early 20th century further emphasized a biological understanding of the event. The mid to late 20th century witnessed a broadening of historical perspectives. Inspired by the Annals school and the rise of social history, historians began to investigate the social and cultural effects of the Black Death. Scholars like David Hurley argued that the Black Death served as a catalyst for change, paving the way for the transformation of European society. In recent decades, historians have sought to further nouveau the understanding of the Black Death by integrating insights from related disciplines, such as archaeology, genetics, and climate science. The advent of paleogenetics has been particularly significant, with the extraction of Yersinia pestis DNA from medieval skeletons confirming the bacterium's role in the Black Death. Furthermore, global history has offered new perspectives on the Black Death, shifting the focus from its impact on Europe to a more comprehensive understanding of its effects across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Similarly, microhistory has allowed historians to reconstruct detailed narratives of how individual communities experienced and responded to the plague. Reflecting on the historiography of the Black Death, we can see how our understanding of the event has been shaped not only by the accumulation of evidence, but also by changing historical methodologies and perspectives. As we continue to investigate this cataclysmic event, it is certain that our understanding of the Black Death will continue to evolve, reminding us that history is not static, but an ongoing dialogue with the past. Modern plague outbreaks, echoes of the Black Death. In studying the Black Death, it's important to understand it not as an isolated historical event, but as part of an ongoing struggle between humanity and disease. To highlight this continuity and contrast how societies have responded to the plague over the centuries, we can turn to more recent outbreaks, such as the third pandemic of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Originating in Yunnan, China, in the mid-19th century, the third pandemic spread globally, causing significant mortality. In contrast to the Black Death, however, this outbreak occurred in a period of rapidly advancing scientific knowledge, which deeply impacted the response to the disease. In 1894, during an outbreak in Hong Kong, Swiss-French physician Alexander Yersin isolated the bacterium responsible for the plague, later named Yersinia pestis in his honor. This discovery was a landmark moment in the history of medicine, providing a clear biological cause for the plague. It challenged the prevailing miasma theory of disease and paved the way for more effective prevention and treatment strategies. Yersin's discovery, along with the identification of rats and fleas as vectors of the disease, led to a range of public health measures aimed at controlling the disease's spread. Quarantines, the extermination of rat populations, and the use of insecticides to kill fleas became common tactics. While these measures were not always entirely successful, as seen in the plague's spread to port cities globally, they marked a significant shift from the largely helpless responses of medieval societies. The development of a vaccine by Waldemar Haffkine in 1897 offered another tool in the battle against the plague. Despite limitations, it was more effective against the pneumonic than the bubonic form of the disease. The vaccine saved numerous lives, particularly among frontline medical workers. The contrast between the responses to the Black Death and the third pandemic illustrates the profound impact of scientific and medical advances. In the Middle Ages, societies could do little more than watch helplessly as the plague ravaged their populations. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, however, they had at their disposal an understanding of the disease's cause and transmission, along with tools to mitigate its spread and impact. As we confront new disease threats in the 21st century, we can draw lessons from these past experiences. The Black Death and the third pandemic underscore the importance of scientific research, public health measures, and global cooperation in managing pandemics. Despite our advanced knowledge and technologies, we remain in a centuries-old struggle against infectious diseases, a struggle that the history of the plague puts into sharp relief. Comparative analysis: the Black Death in the context of other pandemics. The study of pandemics offers a unique lens into the human past and present, revealing shared patterns and distinctive responses across different periods and societies. This is especially true when we compare the Black Death with other significant pandemics like the 1918 influenza and COVID-19. By drawing parallels and contrasts among these events, we can gain a richer understanding of how societies navigate large-scale health crises and their aftermath. The 1918 influenza pandemic, often referred to as the Spanish flu, offers an intriguing comparison with the Black Death. Like the plague, the flu spread rapidly, reaching nearly every corner of the globe and leading to an estimated 20 to 50 million deaths within a couple of years. The pandemic's effects, however, were particularly acute among young, otherwise healthy adults, a demographic group that was relatively less affected by the Black Death. The responses to the two pandemics reflected the societies in which they occurred. Medieval communities interpreted the Black Death through a religious lens, seeing it as divine retribution for human sinfulness. The 1918 pandemic, by contrast, occurred in an era of faith in scientific progress and modern medicine, and was met with attempts to understand and combat the disease using scientific methods, such as the use of masks, quarantines, and the development of vaccines. Fast forward to the 21st century. The COVID-19 pandemic presents another interesting point of comparison. While the mortality rate of COVID-19 is significantly lower than that of the Black Death, the global reach and disruption caused by the virus echoes the devastation of the 14th century plague. The immediate and far-reaching impacts of COVID-19, from healthcare systems stretched to their limits to worldwide economic slowdowns, bear a resemblance to the upheaval caused by the Black Death. However, the modern response to COVID-19 has been greatly aided by scientific understanding and technology. The development of several vaccines within a year of the virus's identification would have been unthinkable in earlier periods. Additionally, the role of digital technology in allowing for remote work and communication has mitigated some of the pandemic's societal disruptions, a luxury not afforded during the times of the Black Death or the 1918 influenza. In comparing these pandemics, we are reminded that while the specific diseases and contexts vary, the challenge of managing widespread health crises is a recurring theme in human history. The Black Death, 1918 influenza, and COVID-19 all represent moments when societies faced massive, unexpected disruptions and had to adapt to a new and unwelcome reality. They highlight the importance of medical science, public health infrastructure, and social cooperation in responding effectively to such crises. As we move forward, these historical lessons can serve as important guides in managing current and future pandemics.